This barless first movement of this sonata is just suspended on an expectation from a dominant to a tonic, with this painful moment where the well-being becomes excruciating in the relative minor, F sharp. And then this reaching violence of rejection of this pain. So like an orchestral, sectionized and fragmented, but then colliding, like Beethoven often does orchestral sections between winds of strings and thematic materials that transition from one to the other. And then these moments of desert. And these things are really meant to be barless, as if the bar starts off a beat, but then since it's slurred, we don't hear, we don't know unless we see, but we only listen, that the music is in anticipation, 6-1, and not 1 and then 6 for the 6 beats. So we have it's always breathless, but supporting a continuous question. And every time we think we'll reach this elegant moment of closure, reaching the extremes of the space, and then the string quartet narrow together and centered brings us to a sort of an inner feeling of perhaps daydreaming, while when we come out of it in few repeated chords, he reaches the anger from the very distant to the present, the second chord, and the third chord. Many other composers would have tried 3 different chords. But Beethoven likes to develop with repeating, insisting, painfully turning the knife in the wound. And I think in interpretation it should be that the first and second chord will be obviously louder from the second and the first, but then since louder than loudest is banged on the piano, it's not orchestral as if you have 16 violins and you can enter in the sound, it becomes a bit more aggressive sound, well, even if that is a beauty by itself because of the hammer instrument. I think it is also best to delay the third. So first soft, second louder and deeper, the third one delayed. optical illusion of distance, like on theater stages that are slightly slanted. So from the stage is one feeling, but from the hall you feel like you have this depth impression. And I think that if pianists want to reach the fortissimo, they should delay the forte rather and do which is so striking about this first movement, suspended in expectation from dominant to tonic, is the ending. With this gentle and elegant now if we observe, there is no upbeat in this sonata's opening. It's all downbeat. 1, 2, 3, 4, if you count the hypermeter. 5, 6, 7, 8. And 1, 2, 3, 4 in the deceptive cadence fermata. And then 5, 6, 7, 8. Moving away to visit the cousins in the distant tonalities of only relative minor, C sharp minor with a deceptive cadence 6. It ends up returning in E major, never left it rather, which is the dominant of A, but we never really were in A yet. Since we always end every question with a question, so we have always a deceptive cadence answering another deceptive cadence, so we are left in this cascade of delayed expectations, but we never felt the A major gravitas. We are into an E major swinging through the different relative minor also, but nevertheless when it reaches the end and is finally in A major, on the upbeat. It doesn't finish on a downbeat. It finishes in another expectation, even if it's a perfect cadence for once, so to say, finally at the end, the closure is not complete, and because of the fact that it starts on a downbeat, it ends on an upbeat, which is not conclusive as if it ended on a downbeat. For instance, if he wanted to do a closure with the pulse as well as with the harmony for the cadence, he would do 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Thankfully he didn't do that cheesy way, but nevertheless it is very interesting because by finishing upbeat, he finishes on the weak beat, so we call it second. But then he does add ritenuto and a fermata. So it's very ambiguous. If we do a big ritenuto, we end up by making it believe like it ends on a downbeat and doing and I am personally very divided between the fact that in the writing he wants to remain elegantly living by the upbeat, and with the ritenuto he gives the ambiguous impression that he's ended the quest since the beginning. And I like to remain a little bit suspended, since the next movement is going to be on the lower third. In F major, therefore finishing up. There's no attacca marking like in 109, where he finishes and the prestissimo comes right away, or in 110, where after all we have the A-flat major opening and then this kind of binom prelude and allegro opening sonata. Here in 101, he's literally bringing closure within this movement, even if the next movement is in F major, just a third below. And I think that this expression of remaining in the air should be prevailing, therefore lesser ritenuto. Regarding the quality of the voicing in the legato, we should sing the parts that we don't play. Mi, si, fa, sol, mi, la, fa, si, sol, sol, la, si, do, mi, si. Or mi, re, do, si, mi. If we don't solfège, we can always la 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 and go la 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 la. So of course we play it with our fingers, and it's 4, 5. No, actually 3, 4, 5, 3, 5, 4, 3. And that is one way to think of it. Another way is to think of it as G, B, E, B, from the long values, and have the short values as passing tones. This cradling. And have the sort of movement by forwarding our shoulders rather than by marching with our legs, and feeling that we're sort of gliding from one beat to the next through the passing tones, and avoiding the expression on the short value, which, as truthful as it is because of the hairpin that opens and blossoms and closes, should be hinted rather than expressively open to a dynamic range, which would distract us from the continuous line, the great line that should bring us to the next horizon point of view. In order to keep that sense of calm and peaceful and surface of the lake mirror kind, very much elegant. And then inside you have in syncopations, like in the middle of the second half of the phrase, la, 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 mi, mi. The short long, while you have the long short, which is the one that glides naturally with the swinging on the beat. Beautiful piano sonatas in string quartet structure genre, and of course pianistically they're horizontal, musically they're vertical, rather the opposite. They are vertical for pianists, like a chorale, when in fact they are stemmed up and down for 2 parts and 2 parts on each hand. So we should listen and think and sing them innerly in the horizontality of their expression of contrapoint. If it was inverted, it would have been as beautiful, just upside down. Or if the A was on the top, the lastinato. Voices interchangeable, like in Bach, whom he studied, and indicating that there is a melody, obviously, which we situate on the top, but in fact it's also possibly or voiced out the tenor. It's not a question of game to say, okay, I'm going to voice this or that just on a fancy on the spot. It's just about the fact that we have to be in our inner ear hearing from what we absorb from the score, which is our only connection to him for this piece, the drawing and phrasing and pulse of each of those lines which play in symphony together, in the Greek sense of the word, in agreement. And therefore we can hear One often speculates that Beethoven was deaf, probably not completely, but at that time of his life, at the end, not hearing the mid-register as much as the extremes, which would explain why in the late sonatas he writes in the expression of the two endings of the keyboard in an exponential expansion, and then very little in the center, except perhaps for sections like where he retracts even musically. But I think it's also to do with the fact that most composers are deaf by definition, since in order to create from inside out, they shut down what comes from inside outside in. Of course, they do take the information and the most likely the imitation of things which strike them. They don't isolate themselves, but to a certain extent, at a certain moment, they do. And at that point, it's the inner ear that speaks out. It's sort of like composing is like writing from memory ahead of time, as if you see the end of a piece that hasn't been written yet. Therefore, his unfortunate deafness added to the dramatic effect of his musical expression. Nevertheless, I believe that even if he had heard, he would have written something as extreme in the expression, from the spacing to the intensity or to the contrasts, due to the new pianoforte of the time. And what is striking is to observe that this composer, who's so peculiar, sometimes even more almost fanatic about the indication, where the sforzando is to be played, where it's not, let's say, intuitively obvious. For instance, in this section, he places it on the release third eighth note of the slurred 2 and 1 instead of, which is the tension release expected of the long short of the 6/8, and all of a sudden it's specifically indicated. And on the other hand, he has a section where he indicates a Baroque ornament on top of the note, which is a turn, as we call, which doesn't have a rhythmic specification. Is it supposed to be tight and elegantly thrown up to fetch the high octave, and we go and we drop, just imitating some soprano or alto in an aria, or is it to be displayed spread melodically like the rest of the eighth notes in this calm? You could have indicated it with a dotted quarter note and fourth, 64ths or 32nds rather, regardless, something to tell us where to place it, as he tells us so many other things, and all of a sudden he leaves it to the performer, as if he trusts the performer. And the composers don't often do so, and especially not him, when he indicates the phrasing that follows with 2 + 1 for the melody, but on 3 on top, which is to say that it bridges through the subdivision of the phrasing, which becomes, instead of, or So inevitably one thinks as a performer, as a teacher, as a scholar, okay, if he was so specific about such details of variation in the touch or in the rhythmic value, why did he leave this free? And perhaps therefore disagree with the performer. I think it's probably a residue of his musical education, after all. He's not that far from the Baroque, as at least we call it, not them. And perhaps it leaves a little bit of fancy for the performer. It's difficult to evaluate how much, but that's one of the facts. Another thing which is very interesting to do in this opening, which is very close to what Franck does later in his violin sonata, is when he starts in A major on a suspended dominant effect. And you have this pivotal dominant and then second degree chords until he finally reaches the shores of his A major. You have Schumann in the opening of his Fantasy starting on the dominant with the second degree. And many pages at the end of the first movement. He brings to a closure this C major, which was not soon arriving. And there is also a song by Schumann, Lied, Mondnacht. Say philosophers answer by a question. The dominant opening pieces answer with a question because they remain on the dominant. And on the other hand, you have pieces like the Barcarolle by Chopin in F sharp major, also starting on the dominant of the pedal with the second degree, just like Schumann in the Fantasy. But in a demonstrative, a very vindicative way, rather, because they sort of jump out from the dominant and go to the ninth, which is a very generous gesture above the octave in terms of interval leap. Chopin, his fourth ballade, starts with this sol stinato, suspended, and finally the ninth again on the major ninth as a appoggiatura on the dominant of F, on which he is suspended. Of course, the piece is in F minor after the introduction. So it's a romantic music effect to not start with the demonstration of the tonality as a opening statement, as early Beethoven in the Haydn style. Of course, Beethoven himself was also, as a student of Haydn, even albeit not perhaps the best, since he didn't study much, was in the Viennese first school, as we call it. And of course, he had this kind of humorous approach to tonality and the way to manipulate psychologically the listener. So when he wrote his first symphony when he was young in C major, instead of starting a symphony like most I would expect would have done, well, he did many pieces like this, like the first concerto student. But the first symphony in C major, he starts on the dominant. Well, to be honest, it starts on the dominant but not of C major, but of the dominant of F major, or 5 or 4. So he starts with the dominant 7th chord, which is not part of C major, establishing the subdominant, and then the dominant of C major, but going deceptively to the 6th degree. And after the introduction ends, he starts on the downed beat and on the tonic. So if the young Beethoven was doing this kind of probably musical joke in his sense of humor, like Haydn did often introduce in his sonata forms and symphonies and quartets. It was not uncustomary for him to try to start on another branch of the tree, and then little by little we discover the root. But that takes time, the A major root. I think also the fact that it's melodically so sung, we have to be making sure that the quality of our legato is true. Finger legato, supported by an intensity on the tip of the fingers and a transmission of energy between the knuckles of the supported palm by a muscular galb, and almost like a suspension for the cars, a very free wrist that allows to evacuate the tension for the tendon of the intensity that is produced by the palm. This way we don't have stiffness in the sound and the hand, nor do we have macaroni of soft sounds that don't have a shape in terms of their projection. And so we have to have this projected voiced top for the melodic line. And as soon as we hear this, we have to take into account the quality of our bass line. And our tenor. And our alto, even if it stays on the same note as in the lastinato. Introduce that change of bow breath that is not a separation as many pianists end up by doing, because they see the 3 slur and the first beat, and therefore it induces a staccato, or at least an abnormal separation of the sound, since there is no air to intake for playing the piano, or bow change for the piano either. It has to be intellectualized almost artificially, but then some chew, some sing, some hum, to re-establish that connection of the touching of the sound production, which of course is indirect, since all this mechanism of the action of the piano is between me and the hammer hitting the string, compared to an instrument player who would be close to the vibration of the sound itself, or with the diaphragm feeling the breathing intensity. And these things are easy to say to a student. Think of singing, think of opera, but in order to really translate it in the piano writing, we have to think of it as a connection that has an interruption while going on. It's a bit like when you finished your sentence, not yet, but you're out of breath, and then you still want to continue. And so you have to be telling your audience that in fact it's 2 plus 4 the bars of the opening in terms of pulses. If you have 2 beats of pulse per bar, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And therefore you have to breathe after the 4th bar, but you don't want to interrupt before the 6th bar. And so you have 2 bars plus 4 bars. And then after that, from the seventh bar on, you have this exponential expansion towards the relative minor. 3, 4, and run-on sentence. 5, return to the dominant. 6, 7 with a little turn somewhere. 8. All this to arrive to the deceptive cadence. After this longer extension, and you would expect that the longer extension of the phrase would be a tension that would bring us to the release, which we expect after but not, thankfully. I deeply believe that the deceptive cadence is the key to the narration in any music of tonal system, because if not, we'd be always done. 5, 1, 5, 1, 5, 6, and traveling away before to return to 1. So you delay your return in order to visit other beautiful soundscapes, landscapes, or family. And this deceptive cadence is priceless. It allows us to open and escape, even if not that far sometimes, but mostly not, and then return home in a welcoming feeling of, we're now back. And this kind of feeling is almost like a charting a GPS for the listener, who is informed enough to follow the harmonic motion, the pulse motion, if the group of bars. It doesn't have to be analytically so clear to the listener, but it gives a sense of direction. And you know where you are in the piece, or towards where you're going, and sometimes purposely surprised by the composer. And it is very important to maintain that peaceful pulse, even if most of the beats don't fall on it. For instance, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. It's easier to do 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, and feel this jump start before the beat of the anticipation before it's slurred. But if it's not, it only becomes its own displaced first beat. So if you're very calm, you feel 1, 2, 1, 2, and not 1, 2, 1. Schumann develops this so much more in that sense, but already Beethoven offers him on a silver plate this continuous syncopation that makes us forget what we're syncopating, since we're no more having any downbeat to compare syncopation to. We're just floating, which is why I like, as in the beginning I mentioned, it's barless. In fact, it could be printed and published barless, and it would be still very clear because of the capsules of quarter and eighth note, but still it will give the feeling that you breathe freely, and you have 1, and you don't know how many bars already, just stay there, and then all of a sudden the theme restarts in the tenor this time, after the beginning, and then the F sharp minor, like it used to go. Are so Beethoven in the sense that his development goes to a dead end, and this dead end to a revolt, and this revolt to a breaking of the system, and then returning to an absolute intensity of but inner voice. And we try often in the piano reading as an instrument to understand the meaning. Why does it go from forte to piano? He doesn't call it subito, but it is. Is it really that this chord drops to this abyss of darkness? darkness or soulful inner voice? Or is it just, I think, fragmental in the sense of orchestration and symphonic thinking and modern thinking for the day of his, that is, this fragment is sort of existing on its own timeline. This would be, let's say, the woodwinds after the strings, and then the brass with the strings. So that in the piano it's a continuum, but in the orchestration it would be a continuum through the different fragments of the sections, on which it would be written for in characteristically so, between brass, woodwinds and strings. And on the piano we have to do it, of course, with our imagination. But it's so anti-intuitive, counterintuitive. Normally we would like to do prepare it just because it's so intimate and not so violent, but the violence of the contrast is its own beauty. So in tempo, no ritenuto, no diminuendo, and almost as if it comes, the sound of this chord from somewhere else, without attack, without pa, just ah, compared to the intense attack of the downbeat of the forte just for preceding it. Of course, one could always think about the fact that Beethoven wrote as a string quartet. Therefore, the parts feed each other, if I may say so. So you have this dolce amoroso melodic line that leaps to the ascending sixth and drops by the fourth. Then under voice in minor relative with harmonic minor mode. Gives the contradiction in the direction that drops while the melody rises. And then third voice, which would be the tenor. And the bass that is on the mistinato. All this is happening in so few notes, but at the same time so much after the explosion of almost vengeance of sorts. Not forte. Piano as if withheld, and then dropping to espressivo in 2 bars brings this. As if nothing happened before, but then the voicing could also highlight the descending line rather than the top. Or both. Or the 3. So you have to make a choice, and any interpretation is a choice, and sometimes the choice to not bring out something in order to bring it out by shadow and light, chiaroscuro. And sometimes it happens on the spur of the moment, and it shouldn't be always determined, even if it's carefully analyzed originally to know who goes where, which part leads to what, and how the whole string quartet genre is unveiling in front of our eyes, our ears, soul. And then all of a sudden, one day you play and... So of course it can appear unnatural and perhaps exaggerated, but it is there. It is nested there. And if it has to be all arranged, organized, and sort of melted into the group, it will sound... which is so beautiful too, rather than... Choices can be done on the spur of the moment, but first they have to be therefore analyzed and followed and practiced, as I said in the opening, by voicing, not but by singing and playing, so you can feel in your body the different parts. Fa, mi, re, do, re, mi, re, do, si, la, mi, fa, sol, la, si, re, do, si, la, mi, fa, sol, fa, mi, re, do, re, or the mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, and you feel like the voices are coming out of you like a fountain, because Bach, well, that's a good Freudian slip. Beethoven, like Bach, was composing this blossoming bouquet of voicing, which all exponentially expand and mostly rise in a sense of elevation, like a spiritual elevation, a transcendence, a plenitude. Compared to, or the ascending calls with a comment. And all of this within simple 6/8, not that it's dramatically enhanced with dotted rhythms, the French overture, any of these effects. It's mostly like flow of a apparently very calm stream, or as I said, perhaps a mirror lake surface like, but with moments of burst or stagnate or well-being. It's a movement of humanity, human character, probably translating the beauty and the goodness and the contradictions and the shortcomings of human soul. And I think humanistic would be probably the best word that would come to mind for me when I think of this gentle and deeply introspective first movement of 101. So much food for thought. Thank you.